Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 1 through 17 in our continuing survey of Old Testament literature and theology. Back when we looked last time at Genesis, we saw it beginning with all humanity in view. Now, as we come to Exodus, there's all of the Israelites in view. And so there's a little bit of a commonality here. In Genesis, we eventually focused on one man, Abraham and his family. Here in Exodus, we're eventually going to focus upon one man, Moses and his family, specifically his brother and his sister. In Genesis, we have Abraham, where he has two siblings, Nahor and Haran. I just mentioned Exodus. Moses has two siblings, Aaron and Miriam. In Genesis, Abraham is called to leave and travel to a foreign land. Wouldn't you know it that in Exodus, Moses is also going to be required, he's going to be forced to leave and travel to a foreign land after he murders the Egyptian taskmaster. Now, the Exodus event, not the book of Exodus, but the Exodus event, is to the Old Testament. This similar, I don't want to say it's exactly, but it is to the Old Testament what the cross is to the New Testament. That is, it is the redemptive event. I'm not saying it saves anyone, but I'm saying it redeems, it purchases, it delivers the people from Egypt, the Israelites from Egypt, in the same way that the cross delivers us from the penalty of our sin. And so it's the event that we're going to see all throughout the Old Testament look back to once it's taken place. And they're going to talk about God's mighty hand and how he has delivered in the same way we look to the cross and how that has delivered us. Now, here's a really basic outline of Exodus. I'm going to give you a more expanded one next time. But for right now, this will work. The Exodus from Egypt, and there's 10 plagues. And all you have to do is remember 10, 10, and 10. There's 10 plagues as God brings them out of Egypt. There are 10 commandments once they get to Mount Sinai. And somebody counted one time, you could probably count it a little bit differently, but that's okay. There's going to be 10 items in the tabernacle, so building the tabernacle. So 10, 10, and 10, the Exodus from Egypt, the giving of the law, and the building of the tabernacle. And those three elements will comprise the book of Exodus. Now, let me pause and talk a bit about the world of the Exodus, and specifically the world of Egypt. We're looking at a map of Egypt, and the first thing you see is the Nile River. It runs from the south, 4,000 miles to the south, all the way into the Mediterranean. So it's a river that's, of course, rivers always go downhill, but in this case, downhill is to the north. And the Nile River is what made Egypt. So here's a picture of the Nile. Took this a number of years ago back. I'm trying to think of what year I was there, maybe 2008. Um, it's a big river. It is fully navigable all the way up to the first what's called the first cataract. Today, the Aswan Dam is at the location of that cataract, that first waterfall. And the further south you go after that, you're going to run into other waterfalls. Ships don't go very well up waterfalls, so it's navigable. That is, you can put a boat, even a small sized ship, and sail up and down it on the Nile River. And there are boats and small size ships that do that even to this day. Um, it's you never have these rough rapids again, and up until you get to the first cataract, the first waterfall. And if you want to go upstream and you're a sailboat, it's pretty easy. You just put your sail up, and the wind usually blows toward the south. And if you want to go downstream, you just take the sail down, and the current's going to take you downstream. You can still see, and as I was passing by, I was actually on the Nile River taking these pictures. Um, I couldn't help but think of the dreams of the Pharaoh and the skinny what is this? The skinny cows and the fat cows. I didn't see any really fat cows. Maybe eating is not all that good by the Nile. But people are still farming. I'm not saying they don't have any modern technology, but I saw examples of people using the same sort of technology that they used 4,000 years ago. There's still people out there with their plows and they're doing work in the fields. If we look at a satellite photo, and that's what we're seeing here of the Nile River, and in Egyptian thought, now today, if you go to Egypt, they have these nice straight lines on a map that's the technical border of Egypt. That wasn't Egypt back then. Back then, Egypt was land alongside the Nile. If you left the Nile and went out somewhere else away from the Nile, then you had left Egypt. So you can see how narrow it is. And then just before it hits the Mediterranean, it branches out into a giant delta. That area is sort of marsh-like. If you're from Florida, think Everglades. That's actually what it looks like. I've driven through the Everglades, and I've driven through the Nile Delta, and I felt right at home. That's what it looked like. Zoom in a little closer. This is not from a satellite, this is from an airplane. You can see the Nile in the middle, and you can see the greenery on each side. Now, it used to be that every summer the river would flood, and whatever it looks green, that's where the flood would go. The waters would flood out. But it wasn't a destructive flood. Everybody knew it was coming. It came like clockwork. They planned on it and depended upon it. In fact, even sometimes the building construction, they had some big blocks to move up high to insert into a building. They would build a raft, wait for the flood to come, and just tie the raft in place, and the water would gently rise, and then they just shoved the block into place. They'd use the flood to help build their big temples. Here we are on the Nile, and that looks like mountains in the distance. Those are not mountains. That's the edge of the Nile Valley. And if you go up to the top, now you're on the surface level of the desert, because over thousands of years, the Nile River has carved out this big, lush, very fertile valley. But once you get away from the area that floods, then it's all dry, and you're going up to the desert. This is also the land of the pyramids, although by the time we get to the Exodus, the pyramids have all been built. We're not going to see any pyramids being built in the days of the Exodus. They had been built for the most part. The great majority had been built in what we call the Old Kingdom. That was even before Abraham. And then you have what's called the Middle Kingdom. That's around the time of Abraham and also later on of Joseph. But by now we're at what we call the New Kingdom period of Egypt, the 18th, and eventually there'll be a 19th dynasty as well. And those are the dynasties that are going to see. Actually, my opinion is that it's the 18th dynasty. And I'm going just by a literal reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 when I say that's the time of the Exodus. So the pyramids were already ancient, they were already standing there. And so we have the Nile River. That's part of what made Egypt. In fact, that's the big part of what made Egypt. Without the Nile River, it would just all be desert. And then we're looking here at a wall painting. Now, this is from the Beni Hassan tomb alongside the Nile, but a bit further south. And notice you can see people that are traveling. They look like travelers or merchants. And you can just tell by looking at their faces, because they have those sort of funny beards. You can barely make out. They are Semitic people. Egyptians didn't have beards. You say, wait a second, I've seen pictures of the Pharaoh. He had this sort of long, pointy beard. That was a strap on. He would strap that on for ceremonial purposes. The Egyptians preferred to be clean shaven, and they were. That was the style in Egypt. So notice you have the garments that are multicolored, reminds me of Joseph's many-colored coat, and you have the beards. This is how they depicted foreigners, specifically the Semitic peoples coming into Egypt. And you remember the story where the Israelites were allowed to come in the days of Joseph, and they settled on the eastern side of the Nile Delta, a place called Goshen. And here they settled, and here, as our book opens in the book of Exodus, here they have been multiplying for quite some time. So we already said this is the New Kingdom period. This is actually going to be Egypt at its very strongest. Now, a little bit about the Egyptian history. I talked about Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. In between each of those kingdoms, there was some problems in Egypt, and so there had been some recent problems in what we call the second intermediate period between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, when some invaders had come in, known later on as the Hyksos. I'm not sure what the Egyptians called them at the time, but they were Semitic peoples, and they had taken over at least that part of northern Egypt, what they call Lower Egypt. And you say that's not lower on the map. No, it's lower because it's down closer to sea level. And they had taken over, but finally by now had been pushed out by the Egyptians. And they had been Semitic people, a bit like at least the Israelites that were living there. And that might have accounted for the different attitude which is now facing the Israelites as they come under a period of oppression. Now, again, that the Bible talks about the the oppression, it doesn't talk about the dynasties. We're not going to have a name in the Bible of any of the pharaohs. He's just called the Pharaoh. I like the way Brueggemann says, if you've seen one pharaoh, you've seen them all, so the name isn't even given. And there might be some truth to that. Any names that you hear are later scholars who are going to try to associate a specific pharaoh with the Exodus event. I'm not going to try to do that because the Bible doesn't try to do that. I have my good guess, but I'm not going to share that here. If you're interested in that, go listen to my classes on world civilization and in particular the chapters dealing with Egypt. But this is a period where we have temples being built. Here we're at the Karnak Temple. This is in southern Egypt, around close to the city of Thebes, modern day Luxor. And it's quite something else to see. Yeah, the pyramids are impressive. Certainly, they're very big. These aren't nearly so big as the pyramids, but these great columns going straight up within. It used to be a roof over top that's now fallen in, but this was just an amazing architecture. And this was Egypt at its greatest strength, at its greatest military prowess. Egypt was at its strength when the Exodus took place. So the Bible talks about as we get to chapter 2, the birth and early infancy of Moses, how the Pharaoh had been trying to downsize the population by insisting that all Hebrew children are to be, especially Hebrew males, are to be thrown into the Nile River. And the parents of Moses hide him and try to protect him. And finally, the Pharaoh said, throw all the babies into the river. So they take this baby and place him in a ark. It's the same word that describes Noah's ark, but this would be much, much, much smaller. This would be baby sized. And they place him into the river with a babysitter there to make sure that he doesn't float away. And as it turns out, one of the Pharaoh's daughters, now the Pharaoh probably would have had bunches and bunches of daughters, so don't try to pick one and say that was the Pharaoh's daughter. That's probably going to be doomed to disappointment. But one of the Pharaoh's many daughters comes down and she sees the baby and she takes the baby and decides to adopt him as her own. The babysitter, Miriam, is his older sister who's been watching over the baby. She comes and she says, "You want me to get a Hebrew nurse to help?" And so it turns out to be his mother that helps to at least wean him and be with him in those very, very early days. As Moses begins to grow up, we read in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, that he was raised in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man mighty in word and deed. Now, that part about being mighty in word, you say, wait a minute, I thought that the Bible talks about Moses being slow of speech. How can he be mighty in word? I've had students that had a very difficult time speaking and yet were excellent at writing. Their use of words was great, but they just had problem getting it out. That might be the case here with Moses. It might be that he was a tremendous author, especially if we take the Torah, the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, as an example of that. I'm not sure that he wrote them necessarily in their current form. For example, I don't think that he wrote about his death in Deuteronomy chapter 34 at the end of the book. But I take the point that he's largely the author of most of what we see in the Torah. And so, yes, a man mighty in word, even if he had trouble actually pronouncing those words. Reading and writing was a thing, especially for the educated, and we're told that he was educated. And then the day came when he decided, and again, I'm going to both Acts 7, which gives us a New Testament commentary on this early life of Moses, as well as Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26, which talk about how he made the decision to associate and to identify himself not with the Egyptians that had raised him, but with his own people, the Hebrews, from whom he had been born. And so he goes and associates him. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that looked like, but then it comes to a head when he sees a Egyptian taskmaster striking a Hebrew slave. And when you see that word striking, that's the same word that was used to describe Abel striking Cain. I'm sorry, Cain striking Abel. So it might have been with maybe maybe that Joseph prevented, or not Joseph, that Moses prevented a murder. Now, I don't want to say beyond what the scriptures say, but it's the same term. And so instead, Moses goes in and strikes the Egyptian taskmaster, does kill him, and then hides the body. But it turns out that it is known, and news gets out. And when word gets to the Pharaoh, Moses has to leave in a hurry. And so after the murder, he is going to become a fugitive. And as a fugitive, he will fly to, when I say fly, he's going to run. He's going to make his way to the distant land of Midian. So let's look at a map. Here we've got Egypt. And remember, Egypt is the land alongside the Nile. If you leave the Nile, you've just left Egypt. And so Moses is going to do that. He will leave Egypt and Midian. Now, notice I've got the word area there. Midian's a large area, but it's based around that general area. And so he's going to run to Midian. And there he is going to meet up with a family, the family of Jethro, and will marry one of his daughters and will become a shepherd, just take on a whole new life. We are told in the biblical account that his first 40 years were in Egypt, and then his next 40 years were as a shepherd in Midian. And if I found out it was 39 or 41, I wouldn't get upset. The numbers seem to be rounded off, and that's okay. But he now spends some time in Midian, and it is there as a shepherd that he has this encounter with God with a burning bush. Now, it doesn't say he was in Midian. Remember, you don't watch the sheep near the farmland. So you always take the sheep to other places, to places that are uninhabited to graze, so they won't eat somebody else's crops and you'll get in trouble with them. So you say, well, Midian was over there. Does that mean that he was in that area? Was that where Mount Sinai was? No, Mount Sinai, I think, is exactly in, or at least in the general area where most people think it was. That's why they call it Sinai Peninsula. And that's a very old tradition. And so he encounters the Lord at the burning bush. And the Lord is going to send him, will speak to him, will reveal himself, will give his name, will give him his marching orders, and will send him back to Egypt as God's mouthpiece, as God's prophet. So, Exodus chapter 7, beginning verse 2, you shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to the Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. So Moses is going to go back, and because he has made the claim, and I think the claim is probably true, that he lacks speaking ability, Aaron is given as the mouthpiece of Moses, even as Moses is going to be the mouthpiece of the Lord. And they'll go before Pharaoh. But notice, God has already said, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that it will cause Pharaoh to resist the word of God. And then God will respond by sending these plagues, these signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Sure enough, that takes place. We have 10 plagues. The first one is where the Nile is turned to blood. And remember, we've just talked about the centrality of the Nile. That was considered to be the source of all life in Egypt. In a very practical sense, it was. It's what, if there was no Nile, you'd be out in the middle of the desert, and it wouldn't support that kind of population. And what's more, there are court magicians that are in Pharaoh's court, and they're able to turn water to blood as well. And so it's sort of striking that you have Moses doing that. Also, Moses, he throws down his staff. That was one of the signs that God has given him. And the magicians, they're able to throw down their staffs. And now, was that a trick, or was that actual supernatural power? We're not told. People have different ideas on that. Moses is exhibiting the power of God. They're exhibiting some sort of power, at least it looks that way. And I'm willing to believe that it was real power, because there are other powers in this world besides just the power of God. Now, everything comes ultimately from God, but there are demonic forces and dark powers and other. They're not equal to God, but they do exist, and that might be the case of what's taking place here with the Nile River. The second plague is a plague of frogs, and it's a picture of multiplication. In fact, we're told that they multiplied, and there were just frogs everywhere, and these were, that's an unclean animal. I know some places where they eat frog legs, and But that's not something that the Israelites are going to look at least later on, is, oh, good, frog legs. No, that's actually a picture of uncleanliness. And again, the magicians are able to bring out more frogs. Now, that's not what anybody needed. They're like, great, we have more frogs. But still, they're able to duplicate a number of miracles. To the third plague, and this is the plague of gnats. And again, there's this picture of multiplication, but this time the magicians try. We read in Exodus chapter 8, verse 18, the magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. There were gnats on man and beast. So there was a limit to the power of these pagan magicians. Yes, they had power, but they couldn't keep up with the Lord. And from now on, they're going to be powerless before the God of Israel. The fourth plague is one of insects. Again, it multiplies with insects, but this time there's a distinction between Goshen and Egypt that we had not seen earlier. So notice Exodus 8:22. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people are living, so that no swarms of insects will be there, in order that you may know that I am the Lord and am in the midst of the land. I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow the sign will occur. And sure enough, it happens that way. So from now on, we're going to see the plagues, but only in the rest of Egypt, not in the area where God's people are staying, until we get to the 10th plague. But we've got a few more to go before we get there. This plague will be a plague on cattle. And some of these, I'm not saying every cow was a symbol of deity, but they had what they called the Apis bull. And there was only one of them. There wasn't, all cattle being Apis bulls. But there was one Apis bull, and that was a symbol of deity. And supposedly when it died, it would turn into Osiris. And there was all this mythology that went with that. And so that was an attack, sort of against their gods, a judgment both against their gods, but also against the economy, as the livestock, were plagued with this plague upon the livestock. Next, we have a plague of boils, judgment upon both man and beast. So it wasn't just the animals that were. Notice there's an intensification that's taking place. And in this case, we see the complete impotency of the magicians, where chapter 9, verse 11, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. But again, the Israelites are being spared. It doesn't come to them. The seventh plague was a plague of hail. And remember, the climate of Egypt, well, actually, we haven't talked about that. We haven't mentioned that. I did say that without the Nile, Egypt would be a desert. And you don't see a lot of hail or rain or anything like that in the desert. The average rainfall in most of Egypt, if you're not on the coast, if you're not right on the Mediterranean, is less than an inch a year. That's practically nothing. And that's for a whole year, and it's less than that. I've I've seen examples of that up and down Egypt, where they don't have one thing they don't have to worry about is rain, but here hail comes down, and that's not usually supposed to happen. But there was a way of escape. Exodus chapter 9, verse 20. The one among the servants of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord made his servants and his livestock flee into the houses before the hail came. Verse 21, but he who paid no regard to the word of the Lord left his servants and his livestock in the field. And these were not little tiny hailstones. These were big, giant hailstones that were just hurting, killing, maiming. This was bad news. The eighth plague is a plague of locusts. That's still an issue at certain places in the Middle East and the Far East. There's an actual photograph of locusts. It's like a big grasshopper that comes and just eats everything. And this would have eaten up especially the crops. And remember, Egypt is a agricultural economy. So they depend on their crops, and suddenly these were just getting gobbled up by this plague of invading locusts that come out of the east, out of the Red Sea, and are brought there by a wind coming off of the east. And then when it's time for them to go away, the wind shifts and the wind takes the locusts away again. So notice, um, like I said, there are still natural plagues of locusts at times, and it's the wind that causes the locusts to come, and it's the wind that causes the locusts to go. God is using what look like natural means to bring about a supernatural plague. So here it is, chapter 10, verse 13. So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord directed an east wind on the land all that day. And when it was night, when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. And then when it's time for it to be over, the Lord shifted the wind to a very strong west wind, which took up the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea, and not one locust was left in all the territory of Egypt. Now, throughout this entire section, the Pharaoh has been making attempts to negotiate. First of all, he makes an offer where he says, "Why don't you just sacrifice to your God in Egypt?" And the request had not been let my people go. The request had been let them go temporarily to go and sacrifice to God at a special place. It would be a 3 day journey out. Um, and Pharaoh says, I'll give them some time off. They can do it right here. This is chapter 8, verse 25. Uh, Later on, he says, well, you can go, but don't go very far away. Don't, just go right outside of Egypt. Remember, if you leave the Nile Valley, you go up to the desert up there, you just left Egypt. So just go up there. No, we're not going to go. We need to go 3 days journey. Um, Only the men can go. Leave your women and children and flocks behind. No, we all need to go to worship the Lord. Well, don't take your flock and herd. The men, the women, the children go, but leave your flocks and herds behind. No, we need to all go. The Lord has commanded that. And throughout the negotiations, the Pharaoh's repeated capitulations are not a sign of true repentance. At no point is he saying, I'm a sinner, God is God, I'm going to bow. No, he only wishes to avoid judgment apart from any real change. And so the Pharaoh's heart, it's a fake repentance, if you could call it repentance at all. And the key issue is that the Pharaoh wants to remain Lord. And the plagues are showing, no, God, he is the Lord. He's over people, he's over pharaohs, he's over all of life. He's the God of this entire world. The ninth plague is a plague of darkness. We read in chapter 10, verse 22, so Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. Again, there's a distinction between the Goshen where the Israelites were living and the rest of Egypt, and there's darkness that comes over all the land. This is not a natural event. This is not just a dust storm that kicked up and put dust in the air. I've been in Egypt during a time where they had a high amount of dust in the air. That does affect visibility, but not like this. Not like this. And it's a picture of the spiritual darkness that was in Egypt and in the Pharaoh's heart. And it reminds me a bit of the darkness that came over all the land when Jesus was upon the cross. You'll remember that. That was not a typical solar eclipse. And this is something supernatural as well. We come to the 10th plague, and the 10th plague is announced that it's going to be the death of all the firstborn. Doesn't matter if it's animal or man, doesn't matter if it's Egyptian or Israelite. Each firstborn, if it's the firstborn child, if it's the firstborn cat, if it's the firstborn dog, if it's the firstborn cow, the firstborn of any animal or human is going to die. So it will be a universal plague. But there's a way of salvation. And the way of salvation is for each household to take an animal, specifically a lamb, and to kill it, and then to take the blood and to apply it to the doorposts and to the lintel over the doors. Now, we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, that Christ is our Passover, who has been sacrificed. And so this is a picture of what Jesus would do for us. It was no accident that the crucifixion took place around the time of the Passover. And we see that in the gospel accounts. And so he fulfills this on our behalf. It's a picture of what he would do for us. Now, requirements for the Passover lamb, first of all, one lamb was to be taken for each household, and they were to be taken unblemished, where you couldn't just pick out the lamb that was blind and lame and ready to die on its own. No, a perfect lamb, a male in the prime of its life, that is 1 year old, and it was to serve as a substitute for the firstborn in that family. Again, whether men or animal, humans or animals, didn't matter who it was, the lamb would die in place of the others within that household. Chapter 12, verse 6, you shall keep it until the 14th day. So on the 10th day of the month, they were to pick out the lamb. And then on the 14th day of the same month, then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Not one lamb for the whole nation, one lamb for each family. Um, and think about this. You were to take it and keep it in your house from days 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 until the 14th day, and then kill it. What happens when you take this little lamb and you keep it in your house with your family, with your children? Well, after a while, you begin to think of it as a little bit of a pet. So that there is this principle of identification where they identify with that lamb. And likewise, as we identify ourselves with Jesus through faith, there is that same identification that takes place where he was treated as though he were a guilty sinner. He was identified with us, connected with us, died in our place. And as we trust in him, as the blood is applied, as we trust in him, we are identified with him in his death, burial, and resurrection. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts. We already talked about this, and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. So the blood has to be applied. There's an application there, that principle of application, where we enter into that through faith. And after they now are allowed, and this is the last straw. Now the Pharaoh says, "That's it." And he doesn't say anything about 3 days journey. He says, "Just go away. I don't want to see you guys again." Chapter 13, verse 17. Now, when Pharaoh had let the people go, and he did, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God said the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So notice they did not go that way. Now let's look at a map. We'll see what that is. We are told that as they left Goshen and they traveled out, the most natural route to take would normally be what was called the Way of the Philistines. And although that was close by, we're told that they did not go that route because um, there were forts along the way and they might see warfare and problems like that. So God's going to take them in a different route as they leave Egypt. We read chapter 13, verse 18. Hence God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea. Now, when it speaks of the Red Sea, and maybe you've heard this before, the Hebrew term for sea is Yam. Yam Suf, technically that's the sea of the Reed Sea, the sea of the reed. Not that there was only one reed there. Um, and the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. As they go up this area, to our map. And the Reed Sea is that area that we call the Red Sea. Now, people have seen that reference to the Reed Sea, and they thought, well, maybe they went through those bitter lakes and they waded through the marshes, and the Egyptian chariots chasing them got stuck in the marshes, got stuck in the mud, and it wasn't really a miracle. It was just like getting your car stuck in the mud. That's not the case. Neither, we already saw, it's not the case where they go that sandbar and out in the Mediterranean, because that would be the way of the Philistines. We're told very specifically they didn't go that way. Instead, they went by the way of the Reed Sea / Red Sea. It's what we call it the Red Sea. The Hebrews, both here and even later in Solomon's day, in Solomon chapter 9, we're going to read about Solomon building a fleet of ships on the Reed Sea, on the Yam Suf, the Reed Sea. He's not going to build a fleet of ships on some marshy lake. And so what we're going to find out is they leave Egypt. They'll find themselves eventually in the wilderness of, let's look at this, chapter 14, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi Hiroth, between Migdol and the sea. Migdol is just a word for fort. You shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. So they're going to leave, notice Sukkot and Ethan, and they're going to make a turn, and that will bring them down to the area of the Reed Sea. And it will look like they're going in circles, like they didn't know where to go. The wilderness has shut them in. They're lost. Remember, when they come out the other side, they're going to be in the wilderness of Shur. So that they're still going to be in the same general area. But this journey through the Reed Sea is necessary both for them to be brought through the waters, and we'll look at that, and I think that's going to be significant, but also to take away the threat of Pharaoh and his chariots. And so Pharaoh hears about this. He hears where they've gone because they're not that far from Egypt. It looks like they're going in circles. And we read he took 600 select chariots. Remember, that was the secret weapon of the day. Not every culture had chariots, but only the first-rate nations, like Egypt, had chariots. And he took all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. Exodus 14:21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind. Remember how we saw the locusts that were brought in by the wind, and then when it was time for the locusts to leave, they were taken away by the wind. Again, we see God using a secondary uh, thing, the wind from the east, to divide the sea. Now, I live in South Florida, and in South Florida, we have this thing. We have these things called hurricanes that come periodically. And we have, when the wind comes, it will affect the level of water on our side of the Atlantic. It usually causes the Atlantic to rise. We call that storm surge. But if you see the same thing at times on the west side of Florida, and I think if just a few years ago, they had a hurricane in the area of Tampa Bay, and instead of causing the water to rise, the water actually lowered, and the bay dried out. And as the eye passed over, the eye of a hurricane, there's no wind in the middle. And so you've got a period where if the eye passes over you, suddenly it stopped blowing. And it stopped blowing, and people were going out uh, into the bay, but instead of swimming, they were just walking on the sea bottom. I'm not sure how far the water went down, but it went down and exposed the ocean bed of the bay. And that's what happens here. We're told it's the wind that God swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night. Didn't happen immediately, but took all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. Now, I don't think it was divided like a narrow little corridor. I think it was probably many miles apart. Verse 22, the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land. The waters were like a wall to them, but it doesn't say it was a narrow wall, on one side and on the other side, but in the middle they could walk through on their right hand and on their left. And so they escape through the sea. And when the Pharaoh's armies tries to follow, then the wind stops and the sea comes back and they are washed away. Now, notice we had the creation story where God speaks it into being, and then the creation of Israel where God gives promises, again by speaking. And of course, we are part of his church where we have a living word who came and spoke and who died for us and then rose again. In the creation story, we saw in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, wind moving over the face of the waters. Now you say, I thought that was the Holy Spirit. It's the same word. Ruach Elohim, the wind of God or the Spirit of God, translated either way. I'm not arguing for one over the other, but I want you to hear that. And then with the creation of Israel, and this is the creation of Israel. I'm not talking about the Jacob story, but now as the nation is being born from the womb of Egypt, from the unwilling womb of Egypt, the wind divides the waters of the Red Sea. And of course, that's our story too, because we have come. The Spirit gives life, and believers, in a sense, come through the water. We've been baptized with water, which is a picture of coming through the waters as we are given life. God has brought about a spiritual kingdom in us. In the creation story, man was created and planted into a garden in the creation of the nation of Israel. And I take that from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, that talks about how out of Egypt I bore my son. And so the nation is being born out of Egypt, but eventually they're going to be brought into the land. Israel will be brought through the wilderness. Now it's going to take a few years, it's going to take 40 years, but they'll eventually come to the promised land. And we have a promised land as well. We're brought into a place of eternal rest. And I'm not saying an eternal cessation where everything stops, but where we rest in Him, and for all eternity we are in Him and with Him. Now, once they've come out of Egypt and they're in the wilderness, and it's got a couple different names, the wilderness of Suf or Paran. From here, they're going to work their way. The traditional location, and I'm a traditionalist here, they're probably southward. That's where tradition has the Mount Sinai being located. Um, Frankly, it could have been anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula. We're not told specifically, but the south direction does work nicely with the rest of the Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy story. The problem that they run into now, first of all, food, and God provides that. He provides what's called manna. And the way they come up with the name is humorous in itself, where they look at this food that God has provided overnight, and it showed up like dew the next morning. And the Israelites look at it and they say, "What is that?" And the way you say "What is that" in Hebrew, you say "Manu," and that's what they call it, the manu. They call it manna. It just means the what is it, the whatchamacallit. They named it manna, and it was like coriander seed. Now, it doesn't say it was coriander seed. White, and its taste was like wafers with honey. Sounds a little bit like dessert, and I'm a big fan of dessert. And God provides them, and it will continue to provide them manna in the wilderness. However, we get to chapter 17, and there is a different problem where it is a problem of water. Notice chapter 17, verse 2. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" Verse 3, but the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, "Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me." They were ready to kill Moses, and God shows up and speaks to Moses. Verse 5, then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile." Remember how we talked about striking the Egyptian taskmaster? Likewise, striking the Nile, that was a sign of killing the taskmaster. It was a sign of, you can't kill the Nile, but it was symbolically killing the Nile, turning it into blood. And so he's going to take, can I call it this, his killing staff, and he's going to take it and go. Verse 6, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. Horeb is another word for Sinai, another name. If you go there, they'll actually look at twin peaks and they'll say, well, this peak is Horeb, this peak is Sinai. I'm not sure the Bible makes that distinction. But you're to go there, and you shall strike the rock. So they're to go there to the rock, and he is to strike it. Remember, this is the killing stick, the killing staff, and water will come out of it that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders. So Moses said, they're ready to kill me. And what God's saying is, no, actually, they want to kill me. And so you will symbolically take the killing stick and strike the rock where I am. You will symbolically strike the Lord. Did you catch that? As if you're going to execute God. And he's going, not only is he going to allow it, he's commanding it out in the sight of all the people. And this is a picture of the cross where Jesus was stricken on our behalf, where he died for us so that we might receive life-giving water. And 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Speak to this and say, how I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Have you partaken of him?